Hey people, YouTube, Mishka Valhalla here. Today I wanted to delve into the subjects of ancestor worship and the burial mounds of ancient Norse societies. So, I'm here out the road, just drinking some ale in my home. I know for a while I've been saying I'll get into ancestor worship, but I definitely know I should start talking about it now. Especially since I've been making less videos than I used to. But whatever, I'll still keep everybody posted, of course. So ancestor worship, the first thing we need to think about when we're thinking about our ancient heathen ancestors is the concept of keeping your family in the mound, and having it nearby. So essentially, you may enter the burial mound or go around the burial mound and seek advice from your ancestors. Our ancestors were a lot more physically aware and more spiritually aware than people think, and what I mean by that is, there was more of a balance, between the physical world and the spiritual world. I noticed that nowadays, we're still holding a lot of Christian baggage, and we think that we should be focusing beyond the physical realm, when the physical realm is essentially part of the spiritual realms, because the physical realm within itself is a spiritual realm. But of course, it always depends on the perspective of each individual. When understanding ancestral worship, you must understand the Norse parts of the self, especially when it comes to understanding what it meant to worship the corpse or the bones and the essence of one's ancestor, and to essentially, for an ancestor to achieve godhood or to become a land spirit, essentially depending on who it is, at the end of the day, they have always had their bones in the burial mounds. Essentially, they are similar to that of pyramids because they are buried with their closest possessions. And the idea is that they will go to the afterlife with their closest possessions, just like the pyramids and just like what we see in sarcophagi in ancient Egypt and many other cultures around the world. I'll kind of be all over the place during this video. I am far from home and I will have this video be quite the adventure. I want to get as deep into ancestral worship as I can. I know there is a lot to cover, but I'm hoping to cover as much of it as I can in this one video. And you can find these burial mounds all over Scandinavia, all over the Isles of Britain, even mainland Europe. You can find these burial mounds all over Europe, and they come from an ancient earth cult that essentially shows itself in ancient Greek, Roman, and especially Celtic and Germanic and Norse traditions. And the Sami in Scandinavia heavily influenced that earth-based, animistic, aura, especially when it comes to the Scandinavian population of Northern Europe, during the Germanic and Indo-European migrations, and as the local European populations molded with the Indo-European populations, you started to develop sort of Celtic and Germanic groups, sky-based traditions and earth-based traditions molding, and that's definitely something that's very prominent when it comes to late Norse paganism. There is a lot of balance when it comes to the heavens and the earth, but when it comes to ancestral traditions, usually it has to do with the earth and with the burial mounds, and the burial mounds signify, of course, the entrance to the underworld. There are plenty of ancient stories of kings and nobles being venerated through the burial mound, and going back, of course, particularly to Norse tradition, you have particular jarls and rulers that essentially want parts of their body to be present in certain places, and that has to do with one of the Norse parts of the self, the liker, which is the corpse. And essentially, our ancestors believed that the corpse essentially had particularly the Norse people believed that the corpse had sort of, a physical and spiritual role when it came to the self. There was, not only was it something that you inhabited while you were living your life in Midgard, but it was sort of a way also in death, especially through your bones, because your bones are what remain when your body rots away usually. When your bones are preserved, your descendants can reach out to you through the bones, your bones essentially. So when it comes to Christian burial, a lot of that was passed down throughout the generations from our pagan traditions. Burial, of course, was different when it came to the ancient Christians, when it came to the Christians in the Roman Empire. But of course, Christianity originally came from paganism, just like, pretty much most mainstream religions. The Abrahamic traditions go back to the Canaanite traditions and the ancient Hebrew traditions, and so on. Especially, I can make a separate video about that if you guys want to, about sort of, a history on the the theology of Christianity and Abrahamic religions when it comes to the God Yahweh. But when it comes to ancestor worship in Northern Europe, the corpse and the bones especially have a direct connection to your relatives, and people throughout the world would make shrines for their ancestors, to venerate them so their memories lived on. And in Norse traditions in particular, there was a belief that some of your ancestors or one of your ancestors could essentially become your guardian throughout your life, sort of like what a Christian would call a guardian angel. But essentially it's like a fylgja, it's what the Norse would call fylgja, and I will make more in-depth videos on the Norse parts of the self. But we can definitely start getting into the liker when we're talking about ancestor worship. It was different per person and per group, especially when it came to certain groups in ancient Scandinavia. You of course had the Indo-European based traditions that were more sky based. So many of them were known to burn their dead, but some of them could have buried, but typically they burn their dead. The sun is coming down and I doubt that it will have much light, but I will still film and continue to talk about the subject and drink my ale. But what I do find interesting is that there is, a lot of ancestor worship, still thriving in places in South America and especially Mexico. They do make shrines for the dead all the time. Of course, they even have a day dedicated to the dead, to the ancestors, and that is something that, a lot of people in the Western world should bring back, as a veneration and an honor towards the dead. But then again, when it comes to, the transition to Christianity, there was, a, sort of a decrease in ancestor worship. It was believed to be a sin and considered idolatry to worship one's ancestors. Essentially, it wasn't God, it wasn't Jesus, it wasn't the Holy Ghost, it was, your ancestors. And, to our ancient ancestors, that was, our pagan ancestors, that was considered, a borderline between the divine and the physical. The physical and the divine was intertwined. But when it came to Christianity, was more of a focus on the Divine Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, everything that was centered around, the Creator. And we were servants to Him, and we were to not honor or venerate any family members after they died. We can remember them, we can mourn them, but when it comes to the ancient people, it was more of a celebration of their memory. And a lot of the time, our ancestors would become gods themselves. And that's definitely why I believe personally that many of our gods, could have simply been, lived a life and then essentially did everything they could to become who they are now. You know, all of their stories, all of their memories, all of their legends is all thanks to them surviving this world and living this life to the fullest. And essentially their ancestors were proud enough to share their memory and essentially live on in their name. And of course, further back, the gods become more animalistic. But that ancestor worship is still a thing. You know, people still worship their ancestors, whether they were humans or even animals. And, you know, I know it does differ, you know, per region in the world and per continent. But what I do know is that when it comes to the European peoples, especially the Northern European peoples, you know, there was, and I can guarantee it as well for the Irish people, you know, in particular, that, you know, there was a reverence for ancestral deities, you know, people that lived their lives and, you know, honored their people, their folk, their family, and were amazing diplomats and were powerful, and they became gods, you know, just by inspiring everybody, showing people that you can be your greatest version and share it with the world and make a difference just by, you know, unleashing essentially whatever power and gifts you have. And that's what these people did. They were great and they were powerful, and they showed it to the world, and they became stronger and wiser, you know, and essentially they became gods, you know. And like I said, you know, people will think differently, you know, depending on people, you know, groups and individuals. But I can definitely say that when it comes to the burial mounds, when it comes to ancestor worship, there was a really hard, you know, line, you know, I mean, well, excuse me, there wasn't so much of a line really at all, you know, when it came to ancient Norse traditions and, you know, ancestor worship, and when it came to, you know, the great heroes, you know, that essentially achieved godhood. You know, those were the people that were honored in society. And each family could, of course, honor and remember their own individual ancestors that didn't achieve that great fame, but essentially that is still part of the greater, you know, picture of ancestor worship. It's delicious ale. I think this is the rest of it. But after that, I will start leaving where I am right now. It's gorgeous, but I can't stay here, you know, because my fire died. But, you know, I'll be fine. But anyway, so ancestor worship. It is a very deep topic, and it does differ from tradition to tradition and individual, because not everybody's family is the same. But what I definitely believe is that, you know, there is a physical level of ancestry, and then there is a metaphysical level of ancestry. You know, sort of a way for you to descend from a great figure in history that essentially achieved heroic, you know, veneration or even godhood, you know, both, you know, in a physical way or a spiritual way, or even both. I do believe that the mind, the Hugi, a serious part of the self when it comes to one's identity, the mind, you know, essentially the identity of oneself, and the meaning, the memory, you know. But that is another thing that is tied to the body and part of ancestor worship. That is why, you know, the bones are an important part of ancestor worship, because the bones do contain the memories of our ancestors. And that's why the bones and the burial mounds were venerated and used in order to seek spiritual guidance. That was especially when it came to the earth-based traditions that did use the burial mounds in the first place. Because, like I said, there were groups of people within both Celtic, Germanic / North societies that, you know, burned their dead. And that was something that was Indo-European in origin, because that is definitely something that you will still see in Hinduism today. You know, building a pyre for the dead and burning the physical body so the spirit can ascend. But when it comes to more European Norse traditions, the spirit goes below into the fertile earth. It goes into the womb of Mother Earth, and then of course it depends on how the person dies, but then again, going further back in history, it could have just been very much the earth, the underworld, where the spirit returns. The original spirits of earth, as they live their lives, they will die, and then they will return back to the earth, and essentially be able to communicate with their their descendants through the burial mounds and through their shrines. The shrines being a way to both venerate ancestors, gods, any sort of spirit, really. A shrine is essentially a way for you to build energy and connect to a specific entity, and it is very effective when it comes to ancestor worship, of course. Because these ancestors are a part of you, no matter what you do, you will always be a part of these beings, these people, these entities that are constantly haunting your mind, that are constantly reaching out to you and asking you to join them, and they are trying to share with you their wisdom. And it is time for you to listen and to not fear the dead. And that's essentially, the main lesson of ancestor worship is to not fear death. But even I fear death, even still, no matter what I see, no matter what I do, we still don't know at the end of the day, what happens, but we can speculate based on history, based on archaeology, even our own experiences throughout life. But at the end of the day, we don't truly know. That's the mystery, that's the curiosity, that's the beauty even of life and existence itself. Anyway, I may not even have enough space on this device to record everything I want to record, but I will do my very best to make some room. But when it comes to the biggest important things when it comes to ancestor worship, it's about being yourself. It's about realizing that these people, these beings, are made up of the same stuff that you are made out of. We are all made of matter. We are all scientifically related, but when it comes, and biologically related, but that ties into it. But when it comes to ancestor worship, our flesh and our blood are linked directly to our ancestors, and so are our spirits, to our deepest, oldest origins. So ancestor worship is a very old thing. It is one of the oldest things, one of the oldest spiritual concepts, along with animism. The belief that everything has a spirit, the belief that the earth, the trees, the animals all have spirits, and that they have a connection to what we call spiritual realms. Anyway, like I said, I would move since the night has commenced. I'm such a nerd. But anyway, so ancestors. So essentially, the ghost of one's ancestor, the var, the apparition, the static image of oneself that can manifest within Midgard, is essentially that is what we are essentially venerating, when it comes to ancestor worship. When we are honoring our forefathers and our foremothers. That was a car, excuse me. Our foremothers and our forefathers, essentially what they have passed down to us, and we are reaching for it. And sometimes they can appear as ghosts, as we call them, or ghouls or poltergeists, depending on who they are. And they can appear to us in dreams or in visions or in waking moments. By the gods, is it dark, but the moon is full, or nearly full. Looks way better in person, but anyway, it is way too dark for me to film this video, so I should finish that for now. I will make a part 2 of ancestor worship. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and please love the moon. You know, it's pretty. As much as I love the earth, I love the land. And thank you, everybody. The wind is pushing me backwards. Anyway, thank you.